So now we're going to learn about our last flex container property. And the last property that can be applied to flex containers, right, that's like a flex property. The last one is align content. So if you look at CSS tricks, here is align items. And just from the phrase of that, it's kind of like aligning items, individual items. So that's kind of how you think about it, how I think about it. And align items, the picture, you only have 4 items here, and you're aligning the items at the top or at the bottom or in the center. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Align content aligns all of the content, right? So here we have multiple lines of items, and all of those lines are being aligned to the top. All of those lines are being aligned to the bottom. All of them are being centered, right? So that's kind of how align content works. And both align items and align content operate on the cross axes. One is just for the individual items. One is for all of the content at once. And so the only way to start to understand the characteristics of each of these is to start playing with them and play with them, look at their differences, figure out what does what where, and until you've got that figured out, just stick with align items, because a lot of students get a little bit like, what the heck, align items, align content, and there's just subtle nuances. It'll do different things graphically, right? Different things with your layout. So you just have to play with them. And until then, just use justify content for the main axes and align items for the cross axes, whichever way it goes. And yeah, and then, in your free time, play with align content. So here we go, align content. So I have all these examples for align content, just like with a lot of this other stuff, where each of the different properties, we have flex start, we have flex end, we have center, we have stretch, we have space between, we have space around. And I've also built examples for each of those, whether they're row or column. We are just, right now, the files that I have open are just these 2 right here. So flex start row. And you can see we have display flex making the body tag a flex container and all these divs flex items. And then we have flex flow row wrap. So main axes, the flex direction is row. Main axes is row. Cross axes is vertical, right? And now we could just start playing with align items versus align content. So let's look at this page without any align anything on it. And just so you can see the rest of it here, right? We have some formatting heights. This body tag will be 700 pixels high and it'll have a border around it. And then we format all the divs. And so I could give the divs a height, 100, a width, 200, margin, border, background color, text align, center. So what that looks like is like this. So they're just all right here in a row and they're wrapping. And I don't have any align stuff whatsoever going on. If I turn on align items, what happens? Come up here, refresh, nothing. So that makes me wonder, hey, is align items flex start the default? Is there a default? The default is stretch. Interesting on align items, right? Because flex start, when I don't have anything, they are not stretching. But that might be because I am saying you have to be a certain height, which would mean they aren't able to stretch. So there they stretch. Kind of interesting, right? Flexbox is a little bit trippy when you start getting into align items and align content. And so I don't have a height, and these guys are stretching. And if I change the space of this, right, they change their size because there's like less room, so they stretch less and less. So, I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out how you would implement that in your designs, because, having something holding content that's like that small and then later it becomes like that big, I'm not quite sure where that would apply, but that's how the functionality works. So that's just using the default of stretch, right? And so that's the default. So if I then go to flex start here, and we're going to overwrite the stretch. So now these no longer have a height, and that's flex start. So I could add that height back in. And again, this is just kind of like, whoa, like I said, align items, align content, kind of trippy. It's easy if you just think about, okay, I'm just moving stuff like we saw in the last example, right? And you can think about it that way. So I'm just going to go down to 3 divs, get some of these divs out of the way here, refresh, and that's what we saw before. And we learned align items moves things along the cross axes, just like justify content moves things along the main axes. And so here we have align items, flex start. Cool, those are at the start. Or flex end. End. Cool, they're at their end. Or center. Cool, they're at the center. Or stretch. Geez, let me take off that height. Cool, right? And they stretched. Let me put that height back on. They're not stretching. It's like, okay, I got that align items. It's moving things along the cross axes. Understandable, right? But then if I have align items and I have more than one row, right? So more than one row, kind of interesting. Like, what is all that space right there? But interestingly, if I go no align items, and this was flex start, so let's put flex start, right? And they have their height, which is cool. And then come back here. There's flex start, align items. What's it like align content flex start? Bam. All the rows are kind of jammed up towards the top. And so what you're not seeing in this picture here is we only have 4 items. We don't have multiple rows there when we're using align items. And when we only have 3 items, boom, boom, boom. But when we have multiple rows, big old space. That's using align items, right? Flex start. But align content, take all that content, jam it at the top. Or take all that content and jam it at the end. Or take all that content and jam it in the center, right? Cool, well, how would align items look in the center? Big old funky space. Unless, let me just comment this out. You only had 3 of them, you didn't have multiple rows, and kapow, we got 3 in the middle, right? But when we have multiple rows, big old space, and if we don't want that space, align content. Right? And so that actually kind of like makes a little bit of sense. It's just this picture here. They're like, screw it. We're not going to get into the nuances of multiple lines with align items and having that big old space. We're just going to show line items with a few items. Top, bottom, center. And if you want multiple lines all jammed in the top without that space, align content. So that's where align content comes in. So that's flex start, flex end, and center with align content. And we saw stretch with align items, right? So take off the height, and align items is automatically by default stretch. Cool. And what is align content's default? It's also stretch, right? So that's the default on align content. So those are both being applied, just, kapow, right out of the gate. So the last ones we have here are align content space between. Space between. And we don't have a height on, but if we put height, there we go. And so it took multiple lines and it put all the space it could between them. And space around. And so this is, again, working with multiple lines. So align content is when you have multiple lines and you want to move that whole chunk of stuff, think align content. And align items is, you can move stuff, but it puts that space between them if you have multiple lines. Or if you don't have multiple lines, then that stuff is being moved. So that's the best that I could explain align content versus align items. And I think it's pretty good. So you just want to think about items, right? Our individual items. And, you can move them up and down and around on the cross axes. And align content is the whole group, multiple lines, move the whole group along the cross axes. And so that's align items and align content. And I'm going to leave the rest of these examples for you to explore on your own. I made a few notes in them, but I've found that just having one file and turning some of this stuff on and off, I'm going to leave it with flex start. Kapow. Leave it up with flex start. And, it's fascinating because right then I'm like, well, what happens if I don't have height? Because that means align items is stretch. Do we get any stretch? Nope, no stretch, just the height's gone away, so I'm going to leave my height back on, right? So that's the thing. You just have to play with it. And, I'm going to leave the rest of the examples for you to go through on your own. I put notes in there, but I've found that one of the best ways to learn this is just to use a page like this and turn stuff on and off. And, remember the height thing when you get into stretch or the width thing when you get into stretch, right? To see if, if taking that setting, the hard setting off, allows it to actually stretch. So that's align items, individual items, and align content, the whole chunk of content.